Chapter 228, Canyon 1. A lot changed once they entered Reincarnted. Firstly, the weather was god-awful. It wasn't eternally snowing in the snowfield, though more than often it was, but there were times when the sun sent down its warm rays. But it was quite difficult to even see the sun in Reincarnted. Of course, the sun would be busily going about its day somewhere high in the sky, but the insane blizzard made it impossible to even make out the color of the sky. With it snowing non-stop like this, it was hard to think of the never-ending crystal of white as anything other than simple trash. It didn't just snow either. Occasionally, or rather quite often, chunks of ice that were larger than pebbles but smaller than boulders would hail down from the sky, and these chunks were hard enough to crack open a normal man's head with a single blow. What the fuck is wrong with this mountain? It's like Sienna cast a spell on it, grumbled Eugene while glaring at the onslaught of snow and ice. Sienna had always been the definition of all brawn, no brains, so she would always cause natural disasters right before a large-scale battle. Among the many spells in her repertoire, Sienna had always favored casting murderous snowstorms and hail over a large area. Of course, the snow and hail of Reincarnted were no match for Sienna's blizzard, and it certainly wasn't strong enough to break Eugene's skull or bones, even if he stood out in the open for several days. Even so, he had no intention of suffering a perpetual beating, so he cast a spell around him to block the snow and hail. However, wasn't it natural to feel crappy after being pummeled for an extended period of time? King. Abel cried out in discontent. Since entering Reincarnted, Abel suddenly became more obedient to Eugene. He clearly understood that Eugene protected him from the snow and hail. "It's getting more difficult the higher we climb," commented Christina. As patient as she was, she also felt quite tired of this mountain. Apart from Noir Giabella's attack, or rather mischievous greeting, they had not encountered any difficulties. Most monsters had avoided them due to Eugene's presence, and the blizzard had also been bearable. But Reincarnted was different. Even though the mountain was connected to the snowfield, it felt like a desolate area completely separate from the snowfield. It was to the extent that the Samar forest seemed like a nice place for a stroll compared to here. Moreover, the monsters of the mountain were fearless and fierce. Even without Eugene hiding his presence, the monsters rushed in, baring their fangs and claws. "This is the northernmost part of the continent, after all," Anise commented. The vast snowfield they crossed was at the northern end of the northern kingdom of Roar, and Reincarnted was a snowy mountain that stood tall at the northernmost tip of the snowfield. This was the edge of Roar. The Buyur tribe protects the continent's end. Molin would say such things with a proud expression whenever he talked about his home. The monsters and demonic beasts of the Devildom are fierce, but the monsters living at the northern end of the continent, which is protected by our tribe, are just as fierce. I've hunted such monsters since I was a child, so the demonic beasts and monsters here feel like gentle sheep. Bullshit. You almost died last time when you were surrounded by demonic beasts. Even gentle sheep can kill a man if hundreds gather and trap him. Why would a gentle sheep want to kill someone in the first place? Molin had kept his mouth shut for hours after being asked the question. The name of the land guarded by the Buyur tribe is Reincarnted. It is my home, and as terrible as it is, I also miss it. Climbing further north from Reincarnted, you will find a mountain range of snow and ice tall enough to pierce the sky. Reincarnted. Reincarnted means north in the language of the snowfield, and Jar means mountain. In other words, Reincarnted means the northern mountain in our language. Well, is there a reason you have to be so arrogant while explaining the name? Buyur means valor in the language of the snowfield. So a warrior of Buyur means a valiant warrior. I am Molin of Buyur, brave Molin. Right? But neither Reincarnted nor Reincarnted can be called the true end of the world. Beyond Reincarnted lies Reincarnted. A desolate land of nothingness, a land that must not be crossed, the end of the world. The tribe of Buyur resides in Reincarnted and Reincarnted to prevent anyone from crossing into Reincarnted, as well as to protect anything from crossing over from Reincarnted. What do you mean by that? There is an old legend of Buyur. Perhaps it is only a story to scare the children. I heard such stories from my mother and father when I was young. In the deepness of the night, the Nur rises in Reincarnted. The Nur treads the wide stretch of land and crosses over into Reincarnted. Any children who refused to sleep would be devoured by the Nur. What's the Nur? Just a monster. I just told you, didn't I? It's an old legend, a story to scare any misbehaved children. I was no longer a child very early on, and as a warrior of Buyur, brave. Very brave indeed. So to prove my courage, I have crossed Lahanjar before. So, did you get to see Roguyaran? It was a vast land, a place where the sky was furious. There was no sun, no moon, and no stars. The sky was foggy and dirty, just like snow trampled on by muddy feet. It was like that as far as the eyes could see. Standing on the tallest mountain peak of Lahanjar, I could see the wide sea at the end of Roguyaran. It was a frozen sea. There was no Nur. In fact, there was not a single living soul on that land. It was a place incapable of hosting any life. 300 years ago, Hamel and Molan had shared such a conversation by the bonfire, and when Molan spoke of beer and the snowfield, his eyes had glistened like a child. Such sparkling, clear eyes did not match Molan's large figure at all, but at the time Hamel had listened to his story without making fun. But instead of telling me these stories, you can just take me there someday, right? Will you go to the snowfield with me? I don't know when this damn war will end if ever, but when it does end, well, I'll be bored and relaxed in many ways, so wandering around new places wouldn't be bad. Hamel, if you go to the snowfield with me, I will help you get with the second most beautiful female warrior of our tribe. What are you saying, you moron? Sienna, don't worry. If you wish, I will make sure you get with the second bravest warrior of our tribe. Stop with your nonsense. But why the second best? You're asking the most obvious question. It's because I am the bravest warrior in the Buyur tribe. Do you want to marry me, Sienna? Go kill yourself. I knew you wouldn't like it. And the most beautiful female warrior in my tribe is bound to get together with me. So, Hamel, I will let you have the second most beautiful female warrior. Get lost. Eugene recalled how Sienna had howled at Molan as he looked up at the tall, snowy mountain. Lahanjar stood as the gatekeeper of Roguyaran. It was tall and wide. Although Eugene was climbing the mountain under Abel's guidance, he couldn't tell exactly how much longer he would have to climb to reach the Grand Hammer Canyon. Woof. Abel suddenly came to a stop. After sniffing around, he stared into the blizzard with his ears pointed. However, he didn't glare or emit threatening cries like when he sensed a monster. Eugene followed suit and stopped in place without passing Abel. It wasn't until Christina, who was following closely behind the two, came to a stop that a bright orange light illuminated from the far side of the blizzard. The light came from the rangers of Lahanjar. They wore thick winter jackets and held magic lanterns that emitted an orange glow in their hands. It had been pretty noticeable even from a distance, but their large stature became even clearer when they approached. The three rangers stopped at a distance from Eugene and the others. Each of them was well over 2 meters tall. Abel. It was the ranger at the lead who called out. His eyes glowed in recognition behind his thick goggles. The ranger glanced at Abel's wagging tail and Eugene before asking, Lionheart. I'm Eugene Lionheart. I am Christina Rogerus. The two introduced themselves. Why are you with Abel? The ranger asked. His voice was husky and indistinct. He appeared proficient at listening and speaking the common language, but his pronunciation wasn't completely accurate. It was difficult to make out their faces because of their thick clothes, hats, and goggles, but Eugene assumed them to be the descendants of the Buyur tribe. His Majesty the King of Roer allowed us to borrow Abel. He said Abel would show us the way to Lehane, explained Eugene. It is not this mountain where the night march will be held. So please go down, the ranger responded. His Majesty the King suggested we go to the Grand Hammer Canyon of Lahanjar. I came here following Abel as His Majesty wished, so will I really have to climb back down? Asked Eugene. Instead of answering immediately, the rangers exchanged a glance. Finally, the leading ranger answered after a moment, We will allow you passage if His Majesty has given permission, but know that the two of you may be in danger. We came all this way with just the two of us, but I didn't feel any danger, said Eugene. The Grand Hammer Canyon is the border of Lahanjar. The closer you get to it, the more dangerous it will become, the ranger explained. Are there more monsters and do they become more ferocious? Or does the weather get even worse than it is now? Asked Eugene. No. The Nur come out in the Grand Hammer Canyon, said the ranger. Nur, it was the monster Molan spoke of 300 years ago. When Eugene took on a curious expression, the ranger continued, The Nur is a monster, but it's different from other monsters. It's not a demonic beast either. I'm sure you will feel it when you see it, but explaining it with words is impossible. What does that mean? Eugene inquired in surprise. I said it was impossible to explain with words. If you are not afraid of the Nur, Please continue following Abel up the mountain. If you two insist on climbing the mountain with His Majesty's permission, the rangers will not block your path. However, we rangers will not be able to guide your path. If you are not fond of the danger, please return down the way you came. The ranger made things very clear. The rangers didn't attempt to actively block Eugene's way, perhaps thanks to the king's permission. However, they didn't allow easy passage for them either. It was because Eugene belonged to the Lionheart family and Christina Rogerus was the saint candidate of the Holy Empire. The two of them had come to the Grand Hammer Canyon at the recommendation of King Roar, and if they happened to die on their way to the Grand Hammer Canyon, the responsibility for their demise would ultimately fall on the King of Roar. "We already came all this way," said Eugene with a smirk. He took a step forward. He wasn't thinking of any political issues, real or potential. He could just climb then descend. The Beastral King Amon Roar, the King of Roar, had said the legend of the royal family was handed down in the Grand Hammer Canyon. He had labeled it the place where descendants of the royal family were reborn as warriors. And what about the Nur? Molan had said that such a thing did not exist 300 years ago. Was the legend of the royal family referring to the Nur? The Kingdom of Roar was founded by Molan. Didn't that mean the legend of the Grand Hammer Canyon also originated from Molan? "Please be careful," the rangers warned after moving aside once they saw that Eugene wasn't about to stop. "Nur?" asked Christina. "Apparently it's a monster that lives on this mountain. Molan told me about it 300 years ago," answered Eugene. "Lady Anise said she's never heard of it," said Christina. "Well, I'm sure she hasn't. When Molan told me about the Nur, Anise was drinking in the corner like a crazy woman, saying that it wasn't interesting," said Eugene. "Well, it wasn't. What else did you expect?" grumbled Anise. Christina involuntarily burst out laughing in response. After the encounter with the rangers, the two climbed Lahanjar for 2 full days. They never slowed down and never rested except for when it was necessary. The only obstacle was the mountain's freaky weather, its steepness and how fast Abel could travel. Abel had been relatively fast through the snowfield but had slowed down significantly after entering Lahanjar and climbing the mountain. He continued to sniff while warily looking around and changed directions while finding the way. Lahanjar was as big as the Uklas Mountain, where the Black Lion Castle was located. So it was inevitable that it would take quite some time to locate the Grand Hammer Canyon. The rangers had warned of the dangers of the Grand Hammer Canyon, but Eugene had not experienced anything over the past 2 days that explained the warning. Indeed, the number of monsters and their ferocity had increased, but Eugene didn't think it was worth the warning. On the second night they set up a large tent and a barrier to block the blizzard. The tent was the same one they had used since their journey through the snowfield. Just as they did in Samar, Eugene and Christina took turns taking the watch. The only difference was that the time they spent on the lookout wasn't as dull as before, thanks to the presence of Mare and Anise. Mare would entertain Eugene while he took on the watch, and Anise recounted stories from 300 years ago during Christina's turn. "The hot springs in Lahain. Am I going in with you, Sir Eugene?" asked Mare. "Are you crazy?" asked Eugene. "I brought my swimsuit. Sir Eugene, don't you have yours?" "It's not a matter of whether I have it or not. We won't be the only ones going in." "Are you saying you're embarrassed because of what others might think?" "I'm completely fine with it. I'm a familiar. Did you forget?" "Stop spouting nonsense. You're going in with Christina or you can go in with Seal." "But what if you miss me? Right? You might want to see me." "I won't." "Then what do you think about Lady Sienna?" "A mixed bath, with Lady Sienna, swims, hee. Eugene didn't bother to respond. He didn't want to imagine a mixed bath with Sienna, nor Sienna in a swimsuit. But the image kept circling in his head. "Christina, did you hear that? That nasty familiar is trying to seduce Hamel," Anise said in irritation. "Sister. I need to sleep. Why do you always lie like this? Christina, I can clearly feel a burning evil flame flaring deep inside your heart, just like flames coming straight from hell." "Sister. I know we've been through a lot, but I am still a priestess, a worshipper of the light. How could you say that flames of hell are burning deep inside my heart? Even if it's you, sister, please refrain from saying such things." "Oh my. I'm not speaking to the Saint of Light. I'm speaking to Christina Rogerus. Why do you keep trying to hide it, Christina Rogers? The only one who sees you now is... Hee, it's just me." "Wah." The exasperation in Christina's thoughts was evident. So you don't have to hide or lie to yourself. You hee. Anise continued with her teasing. Kiawak. Christina suddenly burst out screaming while covering her ears. The memories of the fireworks had suddenly come flooding in. Anise's mean teasing was marring a miraculous, dreamy moment. A memory that was as beautiful and sweet as a dream, a memory she wanted to cherish for the rest of her life, was being warped by Anise. That scared me. Why are you screaming all of a sudden? Both Eugene and Mare were staring at her after the sudden scream. Christina jumped to her feet, opened and closed her lips, then slapped her burning cheeks with both her hands. Oh, I had a nightmare, she lied. A nightmare? Asked Eugene. Yes. An ominous, vicious devil appeared in my dream and whispered in my ears, she said. Could it be? Was it more Giabella? Did that dirty old slut dig into your dream? Asked Eugene. Yes. No what? No, that's not it. It wasn't the queen of the night demons. It was just a devil. Yes, just a devil, responded Christina. I was the most brilliant saint of light in the history of Eurus. How could you call me a devil? This is sacrilegious. Blasphemy, grumbled Anise, but Christina ignored her. Christina calmed her quivering heart and turned her gaze outside the tent. The ground was littered with corpses of monsters that had dared to approach during the night and at dawn. About half of them had their heads smashed in by Christina's flail, while the other half had been mutilated by Eugene's magic. Why don't we just get going? Said Christina after a pause. Did you get enough sleep? Asked Eugene. The devil's whisper blew away all my fatigue, Christina answered with a sigh. She opened the tent's flap. The inside of the tent was dark enough to sleep comfortably, but the same wasn't true outside. Although everything looked obscure and foggy because of the intense blizzard, the sun sat unmoving high in the sky. It was a familiar sight. Strangely enough, the sun never set after they entered Lehanjar. If you say so, said Eugene. Abel also rose from the ground while wagging his tail. Eugene patted his head, then started dismantling the tent. They did not need to rush anymore since tall, rugged cliffs were visible on the far side of the blizzard. From this distance, the soaring cliffs appeared similar to the head of a giant hammer. Eugene and Christina were currently in the valley leading up to the cliffs of the Grand Hammer Canyon. If they had decided not to spend the night here, they would have already arrived at the Grand Hammer Canyon by now. However, taking into account the warning of the rangers and minding their conditions, they had decided to rest for the night before continuing on. I'm fine with going on, but why don't we have breakfast first? You're on duty today, said Eugene. To be precise, it's not me but Lady Anise, answered Christina. I don't want that porridge that Anise makes. It's like swine feed. Can't you do it instead? Asked Eugene. Lady Anise asked me to tell you not to get ahead of yourself. Her porridge is a complete diet focused on efficient absorption and recovering stamina. And why are you saying that you don't want to eat her food when you ate it just fine in your past life? Said Christina. Well, that's because we had no other choice. And there was Sienna, who was even worse at cooking than Anise, muttered Eugene. Lady Sienna's cooking is excellent, said Christina. You've never even tried it, said Eugene. It can't be helped. And you just said it, Sir Eugene. At that time there wasn't enough supply for proper meals. Lady Sienna was the one who made a meal out of such terrible ingredients. Which means, maybe Lady Sienna's cooking skills weren't so bad, right? Said Christina. Yeah, no. Sienna was the worst cook among us all. But next was Anise. Even Molin was better off than those two at cooking up something edible. The best cook was Vermouth, said Eugene. Lady Anise says that Sir Vermouth was better at everything than Sir Hamel, said Christina. Switch with Anise right now. I'm going to hit her once. Can I? Asked Eugene. No, you cannot. This is my body, replied Christina with a firm expression. Eventually, the preparation of breakfast began. However, Anise wasn't actually the one who was cooking but rather Christina. Anise only gave instructions inside her head, while Christina obeyed and used her hands. Let's add wine. What? Don't you know? Wine helps to eliminate any pungent smell of meat and enhances the flavor of the dish. But this is porridge. If you add red wine, it enhances the color of the porridge as well. There was no shortage of ingredients, thanks to Eugene's thorough preparation. Christina poured wine into the boiling pot as per Anis's instruction, and while the horrendous breakfast was being prepared, Eugene cleared the bodies in their vicinity. Although it snowed all night, there had been simply too many monsters, and they had been so big that the corpses weren't completely buried in white. Eugene had no intention of looking at such a horrible scene while eating. After all, he was stuck with eating something that was less than desirable, to say the least. Sure, it wasn't a big deal 300 years ago, but there was no reason to do the same as in the past when they were living in a different era. Eugene suddenly froze while in the process of tossing the bodies of monsters. Christina stiffened as well in the process of emptying the contents of an entire bottle of wine into the porridge, watching the wine color the ingredients. Abel, who had been hovering around her, curled up into a ball and held his breath. Mare had it worse. She didn't simply stiffen up but rather collapsed on the spot. As a familiar, Mare was very sensitive to any changes in mana. Eugene immediately embraced her and took her inside his cloak. No matter what happened here, she would be fine in the isolated space inside the cloak. Mare finally managed to breathe after entering the cloak of darkness. "Sir Eugene." "Hamel." Mare called out in a panicked voice, and Tempest spoke from inside WYD as well. Before he knew it, Christina was at his side. Likewise, she was looking at Eugene with a pale expression. "Hamel," she called out, but it wasn't Christina. Similar to Mare, Christina had lost consciousness in the moment, transferring control of the body to Anis. "Yeah." Eugene nodded. Whoosh. 8 wings unfolded behind Anis's back, and Eugene utilized the white flame formula to robe himself with purple flames. The two did not hesitate as they ran out of the barrier. It was no longer snowing, unnaturally so. There was simply no snow falling from the sky, as if the phenomenon had been artificially stopped. Nevertheless, the world still looked as hazy as before. The two ran and flew toward their destination, but the distance to their target did not seem to change at all. Eugene was unfamiliar with the things he was feeling now. He felt disgust and fear, as well as other similar negative emotions. He instinctively felt repulsed by the Grand Hammer Canyon. He did not want to get near it. In fact, he wanted to get as far away from it as possible. However, though it was an unfamiliar feeling, it wasn't exactly the first time he was experiencing such emotions. He had experienced it once, 300 years ago. Why? Eugene and Anis shared the same question. They had experienced the same irresistible fear once before, a fear that was seen but could not be understood. It belonged to one of their targets of elimination, an existence beyond comprehension. Why here? The Demon King of Destruction. The mysterious, unexplainable existence had existed in Helmuth 300 years ago. As was the case with the other Demon Kings, the Demon King of Destruction had never left Helmuth, and it rarely showed itself. The first time its existence was witnessed was in Revesta, where most of the dragons were killed off. It was a place located far from the capital of Helmuth, Pandemonium, and also the territory of the Demon King of Destruction. After the first spotting, the Demon King of Destruction started roaming Helmuth like a natural disaster, and any armies unfortunate enough to stand in the way of its ruin were eliminated without exception. 300 years ago, when Hamel and his companions saw the Demon King of Destruction from afar, 50,000 troops belonging to Nahama had disappeared without leaving a single body. It was just as Vermouth had warned, don't fight with the Demon King of Destruction. It was such an existence, a presence impossible to battle against. Yes, it was true that all demon kings were like natural disasters, but the Demon King of Destruction was a living destruction in itself. The only solace was that the Demon King of Destruction no longer wandered Helmuth after the war but returned to Revesta and remained silent for hundreds of years. Eugene couldn't understand. This wasn't Helmuth. Instead, this was Lehanjar, a mountain acting as a barrier blocking passage into Roguyaran, which was the end of the world. So what reason did the Demon King of Destruction have to leave its territory, Revesta, after hundreds of years of silence just to come all the way to Lehanjar? No, this is different. Eugene contemplated the situation once more. It wasn't as if he could see the Demon King of Destruction with his eyes, just that he was struck with the same, or rather, a similar feeling as when he encountered the Demon King of Destruction in the past. This is not the same. Just look at me now. Even though I feel it, I'm not running away. I'm heading towards it. It's not the Demon King of Destruction up ahead, Eugene surmised. Then what was it? The first explanation that came to his mind was, Oberon, one of Fury's 4 heavenly kings. After the death of the demon king of Fury, Oberon had submitted to the demon king of destruction. In the end he was killed by his son, but Jagan still resided in Ravesta, the territory of the demon king of destruction. A lackey of destruction? Is that why I feel this way? It's not the demon king of destruction, but someone who's received its power. He couldn't tell. Eugene couldn't possibly make an accurate judgment, so he decided to forego more analysis until he saw what was responsible for causing him to feel such things. Anise came to the same conclusion. Neither of them was struck with an irresistible urge to flee as they did 300 years ago. Something moved on the cliff of the Grand Hammer Canyon. Jagan, muttered Eugene after coming to a stop. It felt as if he had not been getting close at all, but before he knew it, the two of them were already at the bottom of the cliff. No, it doesn't seem like him. Jagan's father, the depraved Oberon, had been a bear, so Jagan would also be a bear. But what stood atop the cliff wasn't a bear. Instead it was a monkey? It was either a monkey or a gorilla the size of a giant. Although vicious horns jutted from its head, the creature definitely resembled a monkey. It was a huge two-legged, two-armed monster with white fur. Now was it a demonic beast? The ominous aura emanating from the creature was similar to a demonic beast, but it wasn't quite the same. Moreover, the repulsive feeling it struck into Eugene's heart was different from demonic beasts. The Nur is a monster, but it's different from other monsters. It's not a demonic beast either. I'm sure you will feel it when you see it, but explaining it with words is impossible. Eugene remembered the ranger's warning from 2 days ago. Nur? Muttered Eugene while looking up at the monster. He saw hideous eyes peering back down at him. The creature's mouth opened wide to make way for a grotesquely long tongue. Black saliva dripped from its sharp teeth and slithering tongue. Kirar. The creature lowered its posture as if readying itself to jump off the cliff. Eugene placed his hand inside the cloak to grab a weapon. Whoosh. But before Eugene could take out a weapon, the monster's head fell to the ground. The snow began falling once again, and in the flurry of white, a giant slung a clean, shiny axe over his shoulder. Eugene stared up at the cliff, unable to say anything. He could see someone stepping on the decapitated head. Molin. Eugene spoke the name of his friend from 300 years ago. Chapter 229, Canyon 2. There stood a giant man. The rangers of Lahanjar and Amun-Rur, the bestial king, were all well over 2 meters, but the man towering on top of the cliff looked to be a head taller than them. He wore fur over his shoulders, though it was hard to tell whether it had once belonged to an animal or a monster. In addition, his left arm was covered in what seemed like a bracer made of an unknown material, and that was all the armor he had. Even in such harsh, freezing weather, the man was without any thick winter clothes, and his large, firm chest and arm muscles were exposed. Yet despite the freezing weather he seemed completely unfazed, his breaths coming slow and steady though his chest was bare. His thick, enormous muscles made the man appear even taller and bigger than he already was. The man also had an axe slung over his shoulder. Appearance-wise, the rugged weapon resembled a woodcutter's axe. Moreover, it looked large enough to fall a giant tree with one strike. In fact, the man had decapitated the head of the Nur, a giant monster, with a single swing, and there remained not a single drop of blood staining its blade. The wind scattered the man's hair in front of his face, and his gaze slowly fell downwards through the curtain of hair. There was no way Eugene and Anise would fail to recognize the man, Amun-Rur. Although he adorned a shaggy beard unlike 300 years ago, it didn't matter. Even if Molin grew a beard, he was still Molin. At least that's how it was supposed to be. Eugene and Anise stood frozen on their spot for a moment. The two stood there in place, staring up at him. Although Eugene had called out his name, he couldn't follow up with anything else. Was it because Molin was taller than he had been 300 years ago? Or was it because he was bigger and larger? Was it because he was covering his left arm with a strange bracer? Or was it because he had grown a shaggy beard? Even so, Molin was still Molin, right? Eugene and Anise saw the eyes that peered down at them. The eyes belonging to their old friend were frigid, and they contained no emotion. It was almost impossible to think such eyes belonged to Molin. Was it because he had not heard Eugene call out his name? It was definitely possible since Eugene had barely shouted loud enough due to his immense shock. Eugene couldn't understand why Molin was exuding such an atmosphere. Eugene could perhaps understand if he were the only one here, since it wouldn't be strange for Molen to be wary of unknown outsiders. However, Eugene wasn't alone. He was with Christina, who looked exactly like Anise. Even if Molen failed to recognize Eugene as Hamel's reincarnation, he couldn't possibly fail to recognize Christina, or rather Anise. To boot, Anise was even spreading all of her 8 wings. "Hey Molen," Eugene called out once more after quenching his emotions. There were too many things he couldn't understand. He wasn't completely certain whether that monster had been the Nur, the subject of the ranger's warning and the main character of Buyer's old legends. What Eugene and Anise had felt from the monster was the same ominous, repulsive sensation they had felt from the Demon King of Destruction, and it had not been a simple illusion either. They had felt the visceral ominosity right down to their bones, and it was something they had felt only from the Demon King of Destruction among all the demon kings and demon folks they had encountered. Of course, this sensation had paled compared to one given off by the Demon King of Destruction, but the monster had successfully evoked the memory of 300 years ago with its presence alone. Eugene couldn't understand why such a monster was on this mountain and why Molen was here after entering seclusion 100 years ago. There was so much he didn't understand. "You moron," Eugene breathed out. But truth be told, what did such things matter? His comrade from 300 years ago was alive and well. He didn't know what Molen had experienced, but he appeared just fine standing on the cliff. He had not faked his own death like Vermouth, nor been sealed with a hole in his chest like Sienna, or killed himself like Anise. So Eugene kicked off the ground and jumped high. The cliff was tall, but Eugene managed to reach its end with a single leap. Molen's gaze followed him upwards and their gazes met in the air. But what Eugene saw were cold, distant eyes. Eugene did not remember Molen's eyes as being like this. They were dull and murky, as if Molen had been weathered and destroyed by the 300 years he had experienced, and Eugene couldn't help but wonder what Molen had been through in the past 300 years after Hamel's death. He looked tired and exhausted, just as Vermouth had appeared in the chair in the Lionheart's dark room. Eugene was about to set foot on the cliff when Molen shook his head, and just before he landed, Molen waved his hand. Although it was a gentle wave of his hand, it caused a strong gust of wind like a storm. The snow lining the cliff soared under the huge pressure and scattered. Not expecting this development, Eugene was immediately thrown backward, never having imagined that Molen would push him away. He was carried back quite a distance by the wind. "Oi!" Eugene shouted. He was dumbfounded and immediately gave orders to the spirits of the wind and stopped himself. Then he pushed himself forward with an even stronger gust of wind and approached the cliff. "Go back." The lips centered between the shaggy beard parted, and Molen continued while staring directly at Eugene's face. "Hamel." It seemed Molen recognized Eugene, even though he looked completely different from his past life. Was it because of how Eugene had addressed him? "Go back?" Eugene's expression contorted with annoyance. He was reunited with Molen after 300 years, after climbing this damned mountain. There was so much he wanted to ask Molen, but the moron was telling him to go back? Fuck off. Eugene had no intention of complying with Molen's words. Eugene once again descended to the cliff after returning, and Molen's beard twitched as he grinned. He raised his axe above his shoulder, then grabbed it with one hand before swinging it into the air. The strike contained absolutely no hostility, but it created a tremendous force that was impossible to resist from the front. Eugene reflexively grabbed WMD from inside his cloak and called Tempest's Wind. Pwah! A storm erupted behind WNYD's trajectory. Even though the sword and the axe never clashed directly, the full brunt of their strikes collided midair. Eugene immediately realized the massive difference in their power, even though he was sure they both had swung without any preparation. Molen's brute force was extremely powerful, just like 300 years ago. Although his eyes and appearance had taken the full brunt of the passage of time, the strength contained in his grossly large muscles had not faded at all. No, in fact, he's even stronger than 300 years ago. The clash of storms collapsed and Eugene was thrown backward. The power contained in the force pushing him back was massive, and Eugene couldn't tell how far he would be sent flying if he didn't resist. As such, Eugene once again called upon the wind and stopped himself in midair, then descended. "That moron," spat Eugene while pushing against the blizzard. He saw Anise's back when he returned to the bottom of the cliff. She was standing in place after putting her 8 wings away. Anise, are you all right? Eugene inquired. I'm fine, she answered without looking back. Instead, she slowly raised her finger to where her gaze was headed, the top of the cliff. Eugene followed suit and looked up at the cliff once more. Where did that moron go? Eugene asked with a deep frown. He couldn't see Molen or the corpse of the monster. Anise shrugged and looked back. I don't know. He suddenly disappeared in the snowstorm. That stupid idiot disappeared with that stupidly big corpse? What, did he grab the corpse and hop away? Asked Eugene. No. Although I don't know much about magic, Molen disappeared with the body like it was magic. They disappeared in the blink of an eye, said Anise. I'll take a look myself, grumbled Eugene, approaching Anise. I've already put away my wings, said Anise. Well, you can take them out again. And since when did you have to take out your wings to fly? I know you can do it without your wings. Or you can just jump. You can jump that much, can't you? Eugene continued with his grumbling. Although the cliff was relatively high, Eugene had no doubt that Anise was more than capable of hopping to the top. Christina lacks the physical abilities. And I need my wings to look sacred, don't I? Replied Anise. It's not like anyone is watching right now. Oh right. I guess it's just you and me right now, Hamel, Anise said with a smile. Christina would have screamed out of embarrassment if she were awake, but unfortunately she was still unconscious inside her mind. Anise had hoped for Eugene to blush with embarrassment, but he looked nonchalant. In the first place, Eugene wasn't embarrassed by what he had said during the fireworks, so why would he feel embarrassed now? Then I guess there's no helping it, Eugene said before taking giant strides up to Anise. After stopping in front of her, he suddenly placed his hand on her waist. Anise's brain short-circuited by Eugene's unexpected, sudden action. However, Eugene brought her into his embrace and carried her without caring for how she had stiffened. Stay still, said Eugene. It was a reasonable choice by Eugene's standards. Although he couldn't see Molen on the cliff now, wasn't it possible that he was hiding somewhere? Moreover, Molen could well swing his axe once more like before. Of course, Eugene knew Anise was strong enough to protect herself, but he judged it would be safer to carry her as he flew up. Pee-pee Princess carry. In fact, Anise had been secretly looking forward to something like this happening. However, she had hoped Eugene's face would be dyed red, and he would hesitate when she suggested he do this rather than him taking the initiative. In other words, Anise had not been prepared for Eugene to carry her like this. So she could not poke fun at him but quietly allowed him to carry her in his arms instead. She was certain she could regain her composure and tease him if she were in his arms for a while. But, unfortunately, the tall cliff took only one simple leap for Eugene to climb. He's not here, grumbled Eugene after landing on the cliff as he put Anise down. No, to be exact, he attempted to put her down. After belatedly coming to her senses, Anise wrapped her arms tightly around Eugene's neck. Even though he had already released her from his arms, she held on to his neck by squeezing her arms tightly. The strength Eugene felt in her arms made it quite hard to believe she was physically lacking. What are you doing? Asked Eugene. Anise didn't have a good answer, so she cleared her throat instead while slowly loosening her grip. She descended, then looked around before commenting, "It's clean." "I know," replied Eugene. The Nur had been a monster as big as a giant. It wouldn't have been strange for its black blood to dye all the snow on the cliff, but strangely enough, the ground was spotless and white. Moreover, there were no traces of a body being dragged away. "You're right. It's like magic," muttered Eugene with a scoff. Was it possible that Molen had learned magic during the 300 years? It wasn't an impossibility. Eugene turned his head and looked at Anise. She had said that Molen had disappeared with the monster's body like magic. Yes, it was true that Anise didn't know much about magic. But just because Anise herself didn't know how to use magic didn't mean she couldn't recognize it. This phenomenon had not been caused by magic but by something similar to magic. Eugene looked around once more. Even while holding Akasha in his cloak, he couldn't figure out how Molen had disappeared with the body. "Did Molen not say anything to you?" Eugene asked. "He said nothing, Hamel. He just looked at me for a moment before you came back," answered Anise. "How did Molen disappear?" asked Eugene. "Suddenly. Just like magic. I don't know exactly how, and although I said he disappeared in the blink of an eye, I didn't actually close my eyes, just that he disappeared that quickly and suddenly. He disappeared in the snowstorm as if he had never been there to begin with," replied Anise. There's only one explanation I can infer from what you're saying, and the trace is here, said Eugene. A barrier, said Anise, nodding. It was likely that the cliff itself straddled a boundary as a barrier. Molen and the Nur's body had been on a different cliff that paralleled this one. For barriers like these, there was bound to be a totem that powered it. However, no matter how he tried, Eugene could not see through the barrier even with a kashal, and he couldn't blindly search for the totem, not knowing what lay beyond the cliff and the barrier. Let's go down, Eugene said with a deep frown. That's what Molen said. To go back. And since when were you so obedient to what Molen said? Asked Anise. Molen is older than me, replied Eugene. He was also older than you 300 years ago, countered Anise. At that time, Molen was older than me by only 3 or 4 years, said Eugene. 5 years, Anise corrected. In those days, a difference of 5 years was nothing. We were all just friends anyways. If we're talking about specifics, Anise, you were 2 years older than me, said Eugene. 3 years, she corrected once more. At that time we were all equal regardless of our ages and when we were born. But it's been 300 years and that bastard Molen had aged by 300 years. I'm sure he didn't tell me to get lost just because he doesn't like me, so let's go back down and figure things out, said Eugene. How cute, commented Anise. What? Regardless of your reason, you're showing respect for Molen's will. Hamel, are you afraid of being pushed back by Molen again while stubbornly searching this place? Asked Anise. Stop saying weird things. Molen is alive and I'm sure he has his reasons. That's what we call respect, sniggered Anise before turning away. She jumped down from the cliff, thinking that Hamel looked incredibly cute with his shy face, mumbling like an idiot. Ah. It wasn't until she reached the ground that she belatedly came to a realization. She could have asked him to help her down, saying it was too high. If she had, she could have made him carry her like a princess once more. Anise hurriedly turned her eyes upward with regret. Eugene was looking down at her with narrowed eyes and an absurd expression. Ehem. Anise cleared her throat while soothing her disappointment. Abel was waiting for them with droopy ears when they returned to the tent. The ominous feeling similar to the demon king of destruction had disappeared with the death of the Nur, or the unknown monster. Thanks to that, Abel didn't appear as scared as before. A little while later, Mare gently poked her head out of Eugene's cloak, and Christina also came to her senses. Christina felt ashamed of herself for fainting without managing to put up any resistance and blamed herself. It's only natural for you to have fainted, Christina. After all, you've never experienced anything like that before, right? Anise consoled her. Eugene did the same. We almost fainted 300 years ago even though we had been through all sorts of things. But that wasn't the demon king of destruction, Christina said, gathering her breath. But it was similar. Don't let it weigh too heavily on your heart. It's like an instinctive fear, something you can't really resist without experience. Eugene reassured her as they finished their meal from before. The porridge had gone cold, so they boiled it again. The taste was worse than usual. 2 days later, Eugene and Christina crossed the boundary of Lahanjar and arrived at Lahane's training grounds. It was a fortress protected by high walls but shaped like a village attached to a castle. The knights of the kingdom of Ruhr mainly used the training grounds, but the people of the Buyur tribes resided in the village. The ones who had not left the snowfield had been managing the fortress since it was built while living in the village. Most of Lahanjar's rangers were natives of Buyur who were born in the village, and many young warriors dreamt of someday going to Hamilon, the capital, to become chosen knights of the king. It's big, mumbled Eugene after entering the fortress. He wasn't just referring to the fortress either. The native residents of the village were tall and big, just like Molen, the king of Ruhr, and the rangers of the snowy mountain. Eugene was also quite tall, but he couldn't see any men in the fortress who were shorter than him. In any case, the fortress itself was enormous as well. It was for the night march. As soon as the site of night march had been confirmed, the bestial king had ordered for the Lahane's fortress to be expanded extensively. Eugene didn't know exactly how many knights and mercenaries were coming to the night march, but the expanded fortress looked big enough to accommodate all visitors. The burning river, said Eugene. A hot, steam-breathing river flowed through the outskirts of the village. Perhaps thanks to it, it didn't feel very cold despite the snow. You are not allowed to enter without washing up and not allowed to enter wearing anything other than a bathing suit, answered the villager responsible for showing them around. I'm not going in. We don't see many visitors here normally, and many outsiders who are here seem quite mistaken. This is the end of the northern snowfield, and the natives of Buyur have resided in this place for a long time. Unfortunately, that means they like to think we are ignorant and barbaric, continued the villager with a shrug. Like the other natives, he was tall, an entire head taller than Eugene. But we are not as ignorant or barbaric as they think us to be. The burning river. Indeed, it feels great to go in there when it snows, but that doesn't mean we enter it without first washing up. If you really want to do something like that, you can use the private hot spring at your own house. The river belongs to the village, so you shouldn't make your neighbors uncomfortable. Everyone here respects the rule, said the villager. Is that so? Said Eugene. But the Lionheart clan is a friend of our founder. Although 300 long years have passed, the Lionheart clan is still a friend to the Roar family. So, Sir Eugene Lionheart, if you would like to jump into that river right now, the villager said hesitantly. Has someone already jumped in? Asked Eugene. He felt his heart drop slightly. No, they didn't jump in. Rather, they walked on the hot spring saying it was amazing without even removing their shoes, the villager answered. It must have been Lady Carmen, muttered Eugene. How did you know? The villager asked with surprise. Lady Carmen is the only one who enjoys such eccentric behavior in the Lionheart family. I apologize on her behalf as a member of the family, said Eugene. We have already heard enough apologies, the villager answered. The other members of the Lionheart family had departed a few days ahead of Eugene and had arrived in Lehane earlier. However, Cyan, Seal, Dior and Princess Scalia had yet to arrive. Eugene felt inwardly worried, but he did not rush to search for them, partially because of what Anise had said to him before. He couldn't continue to treat them like they were children. The guests from the Lionheart clan are staying at this mansion, the villager said as they arrived at a large mansion close to the castle. It is the mansion with the largest hot spring, except for the castle and the town's public baths. The kings and royal knights of different nations were staying at the castle. There were still 4 days until the beginning of the night march, but the kings of each country except Roar's own king had already arrived. Burius, the Pope of the Holy Empire. Strat II, the Emperor of the Kiel Empire. Alibur, the Sultan of Nahama. Daendolf, the King of Arath. The leaders of the empires and the equivalent nations were present, as well as King Regos, King of the Flavor Kingdom and the Director of the Anti-Demon Alliance, and other kings belonging to the Alliance. Most of the continent's rulers, apart from those of Helmuth, were currently staying in this fortress. Well, please enjoy your stay, the villager said before returning. Eugene stared up at the castle for a while. He could already feel a few gazes belonging to arrogant people who had no desire nor reason to hide their eyes. Eugene could feel the gazes coming from different heights. It was quite obvious. Not all kings stood on equal ground, and empires were superior to kingdoms, while kingdoms could be divided into large and small kingdoms. He was the second coming of the Great Vermouth. Even though he wasn't set to be the next head of the family, he was a young lion of the main family of the Lionheart clan who would surely lead the next generation. The rulers of royal authority were paying keen attention to Eugene. Sir Eugene. I'm not going to be rude. I'm just looking up, that's all, said Eugene with a smirk. He then turned his head before walking into the mansion with light steps. They can look all they want from up there. Chapter 230, Lehane 1. The Lionheart family mobilized 100 knights for the night march, apart from the members of the family. There were 40 white lions and 60 black lions. The knights of the White Lion protected the main family and there were quite a few of them. As such, it wasn't a big problem even if 40 of them were absent. However, the same wasn't true of the Black Lion Knights. The Black Lion Castle was located at the Uklas Mountains at the border of Kiel, and beyond it lay the great forest of Samar. The natives of the forest were always trying to sneak past the border into Kiel at every opportunity, and there were criminals of Kiel and other nations trying to sneak past the border to avoid punishment. The main duty of the Black Lions was to serve as guardians of the border at the Uklas Mountains, and they were recognized by the Kiel Empire for their strength and valor. Since Uad's uprising a year ago, the Black Lion Knights had greatly increased their power, but most of the knights that they had recruited were youngsters from the countryside. If the elite knights were mobilized to participate in the night march, the castle would be left with rookie knights. Thus, half of the commanders and elite knights of the Black Lion stayed back at the castle, and as a result in the mansion, there were quite a few new faces among the Black Lion knights that Eugene didn't recognize. Of course, he knew that they were all there to participate in the Night March, a grueling ritual that would bring even the strongest of warriors to their limit. As he made his way to the center of the room, he couldn't shake the feeling that all eyes were on him, watching his every move. But not all of them were unfamiliar faces. Eugene stared at Gargith, who was intently peering at him while proudly sticking out his chest. Just like Desra, Gargith had decided to join the Black Lion Knights. Eugene didn't say a word and looked at the man standing next to Gargith, Genos, the captain. Originally, he had been in charge of the 2nd Division. However, after Dominic had passed, his division had gone up one rank. Eugene cleared his throat when he felt the heat of their gazes. It had been quite a while since he had last met with Genos or Gargith, but Eugene felt rather embarrassed seeing how Genos' eyes were filled with tears. What an achievement. The last time Genos had seen Eugene was at the Black Lion Castle 1 year ago. At that time, Eugene had been unbelievably strong, and he had shown an insane rate of growth. It had been a year since then, and Eugene's growth was sufficient to astonish Genos. With that said, Genos didn't take the shock all that hard. In a way, he thought it was only natural. Genos knew that Eugene was actually Hamel, a member of the Heroes Party from 300 years ago. Although his body belonged to a 21-year-old, his soul was much older, which made his explosive growth only natural. With that said, Hamel had not learned the Lionheart's white flame formula in his past life. In other words, his current training method was completely different from his previous one. And even though he also practiced magic at the same time, he was the first in the Lionheart's history that managed to reach the 6th star of the white flame formula at the age of 21. Genos thought it regrettable that there were other Lionhearts around him right now. If he had been alone, he would have allowed his tears to flow freely in praise of Hamel's greatness. He still had a deep desire to do so, but he couldn't, not here, not now. He took a sideways glance at Gargith's face. It was impossible to believe that it belonged to a 23-year-old. "Was there anything you wanted to say to me?" asked Eugene while glancing at Genos. He had a lot to say, but he couldn't speak his mind with Gargith standing right there. "Well, great job coming all this way," answered Genos. "Where is the family head?" asked Eugene. "With the elders. They went to the castle to discuss the schedule while we're here," said Genos. Eugene nodded before shuffling his gaze towards Gargith, who was still sticking out his chest proudly. "Why are you doing that?" asked Eugene. "Let's go take a bath," responded Gargith. It was quite out of the blue, but there was no reason for Eugene to refuse. He glanced back and saw Christina's eyes twinkling. Of course, it wasn't as if she were looking forward to a mixed bath or anything. The two of them had traversed the snowfield for almost a month. Although they had kept themselves clean and kept their hygiene with magic, their desire to soak in a hot bath wasn't something that could be soothed by magic. In the end, Eugene and Christina ended up following Gargith to the bath. It was an open-air bath that covered the entirety of the mansion's backyard. "Do I go in with you?" asked Mare. "Cut the nonsense and go with Christina," replied Eugene. He ignored how the familiar pouted and handed her over to Christina before entering the men's bath with Gargith. "Have you seen the inhabitants of Beer?" asked Gargith. "I did," answered Eugene. "All of them had beautiful muscles. It is said that the hot springs here are very helpful for muscle growth," said Gargith. "I see," Eugene muttered. "Congratulations on reaching the 6th star of the white flame formula," continued Gargith. "Thank you," responded Eugene. "Are you not going to congratulate me in response?" asked Gargith. "Well, congratulations on becoming a Black Lion." "I didn't come here to take a bath with you because I wanted to hear those words," said Gargith. The hot spring was truly wonderful, and it reminded Eugene of how Molin used to speak about the hot river of his hometown. Vermouth had also said a few things about the hot springs as well. Was it that simply soaking in it relieved your fatigue? Well, it was true. It's not just fatigue. The hot river is filled with medicinal water that heals diseases and wounds, so just soaking in it for a bit works quite great. It's especially good for the skin, so women love it. Indeed, when Eugene took a better look at the hot spring water, he could see that it had dense mana. The water suddenly bubbled, and when Eugene looked to the side to find the source of the commotion, he could see Gargith wiggling his muscles. Your body's gotten better, stuttered Eugene with a sour face. He felt an unspoken pressure, and only then did Gargith nod with a satisfied expression. There seems to be a lot of debate about the joint training, said Gargith. Is it because of the danger? Asked Eugene. That's right. No matter how careful you are, a blind knife can easily take a man's life. And it's not like we're training with a single organization either. The knights who have gathered in Lehane all belong to different orders and groups. If there's even a little bit of political agenda involved, it could easily lead to deliberate maiming, answered Gargith. The purpose of the Night March was to unite the nations and knightly orders of the continent. But even children suffered injuries and even died if they were unlucky during war games, so it was practically impossible for there to be no accidents during training for the knights. The Night March is supposed to be a bunch of friendly matches held between knight orders for the purpose of training. And wasn't it decided that it would take the form of a war of occupation this time around? Asked Eugene. That's what was decided, but apparently Nahama's sultan is complaining. He's saying that the desert warriors and the assassins won't be able to display their full abilities since the snowfield is completely different from the desert, answered Gargith. So what does he want them to do? Asked Eugene. He's asked to summon a large number of monsters in Lehane instead and go on an expedition. Although it's a sudden proposal, quite a few nations are supporting it, said Gargith. Well. Eugene knew exactly why the Sultan had made such a proposal. Since ancient times, Nahama's desert was riddled with many dungeons of wizards, since the desert was a perfect place to set up dungeons underground. Just like the factions in Arath were divided into magic towers, desert factions were split among a number of dungeons. The Sandmancers of Nahama belonged to one such faction. However, it didn't mean that the dungeons stood on equal ground with the magic towers. If the two had really been equal, Arath could never have taken its title of the Magic Kingdom. There was a crucial difference between Nahama and Arath, apart from the quality and number of wizards. The royal family of Arath did not demand complete obedience and deference from the magic towers, but the Sultan of Nahama very much did demand that from the dungeons. If Nahama's Sultan suggested summoning monsters, it meant that he was accompanied by dungeon wizards specializing in that kind of magic. It seems he doesn't want to be transparent about his forces. The Sultan had made such a suggestion while other kings supported it, and it was quite obvious why. If two powers collided, they would each acquire a clear picture of the other's forces. In addition, it wasn't like this was a simple bar fight or anything like that. The Night March was a gathering of knights from all over the world, and even if the matches hosted were friendly and only for the sake of training, the honor of each nation and knightly order was at stake. One was free to hide their true power if they so wished, but they would be forced to suffer defeat as a consequence, which would lead to a loss of honor. However, if they were faced against monsters, they didn't have to worry about having their hidden aces revealed. As such, the Sultan's proposal was a refreshing scratch for the itch that many leaders had been feeling. They had been inwardly dissatisfied about the Night March. Why was the Night March being held in the first place? It was because of the Demon King of Incarceration's warning to the world. A hint that the Demon Kings of Helmuth might once again threaten the world after 300 years of silence and peace. And who had first heard the warning? It had been Eugene. However, the Emperor of Kiel had never once summoned Eugene even after being briefed by the Lionheart family. The same had been true in Arath. During Eugene's hearing, Daendolf, the king of Arath, had delegated authority to his son Honian, instead of attending the meeting himself. Eugene was the successor of Sienna the Wise, the second coming of the Great Vermouth, and the one warned directly by the Demon King of Incarceration. There had been more than enough reasons for Daendolf to desire a meeting with Eugene to talk to him. Even so, Daendolf had not met with Eugene and kept his distance instead. Idiots. Eugene frowned. In the end, the Night March was only a half-baked meeting that appeared reasonable on the surface. The leaders of the nations didn't actually believe that the Demon King of Incarceration was going to break peace. It was somewhat understandable. If the Demon King of Incarceration had wanted to, there had been more than enough opportunities for him to do so from the beginning. During these past 300 years, I feel like I have continued to show a sufficient amount of goodwill and respect to Vermouth's descendants. I have respected their freedom to not show me any goodwill or respect in return. However, I am concerned that you may be taking my continued goodwill for granted. With freedom comes responsibility. Freedom without responsibility is just indulgence. Descendant of Vermouth, tell this to everyone in the Lionheart clan. Do not take the goodwill that I have granted you as an incentive to go too far. If you will not give me my due regard, then I shall no longer respect you either. The demon king of incarceration had warned him thus in the desert tomb. It had been a very direct, blatant warning, and the night march was no different than a show of force against the demon king of incarceration's warning. But Eugene couldn't help but wonder whether the combined forces of the continent was enough to shock the demon king of incarceration. I don't know if it would be enough if everyone was completely united. But that's not even the case. Everyone's busy trying to hide what's on their plates. In Eugene's opinion, the current predicament was a result of how blatant, yet lax the demon king of incarceration's warning had been. Couldn't the guy have warned them that he would destroy the continent in a few years instead? The demon king of incarceration had left considerable room for interpretation in his warning. He wouldn't show any respect if they did not respect him in turn. Didn't that mean he would show respect as long as they showed him due regard? It was easy to interpret it as a conditional declaration of war. Your ancestor may have made an oath in exchange for his freedom, but now the end of that promise is drawing near. The time is coming for the wheel that has stalled to resume moving forward once more. Someday we may have to make a new oath. I wonder who will be able to make a new promise in Vermouth's stead, and stop this wheel once more. Little bastard, muttered Eugene under his breath. With the demon king of incarceration's warning being so ambiguous, wasn't it natural for the leaders of the nations to be cautious in their response? The last 300 years had been an era of unprecedented peace, so which king would really hope and prepare for war? At least it was quite obvious that no one wanted war to afflict their own country. If Night March fizzled out like this, would there really be any changes? Perhaps. Firstly, the Anti-Demon Alliance would have their troops pull back, deciding that it would act as a show of respect to the demon kings and allow them to avoid war. The only reason the Anti-Demon Alliance would wait until after the Night March would be for the sake of saving face. In fact, the Night March itself ultimately served for the nations to try and one-up each other. A good beating would get some sense into them. Eugene propped himself out of the bath. Perhaps because of how hot the spring water was, it felt as if heat was coursing to his head faster than usual. He felt rather irritated and annoyed. Why was it Nahama's Sultan, of all people, issuing a complaint now, just days before the beginning of Night March? Nahama had invaded Tiraz over the course of hundreds of years. Helmuth looked the other way each time, and there was suspicion that the demon king of incarceration was responsible for instigating them. Eugene hadn't been a fan of Nahama 300 years ago and didn't like them very much now either. Even the damned assassins of Nahama were just pieces of shit who only prioritized their own interests, even if it meant backstabbing their allies in the battlefield. The sultan of such trash is naturally a piece of crap himself. Maybe he's complaining like a little baby on the orders of the demon king of incarceration. But would the demon king of incarceration really do that? For what reason? What could he be scared of? Eugene's rational mind gave him plausible answers, but he decided to ignore them. In fact, it didn't matter to Eugene how the night march ended. It was none of his business. Regardless of how hard the kings tried to hide what was on their plates, Eugene had his own business to attend to. He didn't care what they were trying to do since it was clear to him what he had to do. True, it would be helpful if he had more numerous, powerful allies. However, recalling his experiences from 300 years ago, Eugene knew that having more soldiers in a war against existences like the Demon Kings didn't make a big difference. It was because of the damned necromancers. As the scale of the battles increased, the number of corpses increased accordingly, which allowed the necromancers to raise more corpses as soldiers of the armies of the Demon Kings. I'm not a huge fan of huge wars either. If I could, I would invade the castle alone and kill the Demon King of incarceration. That is an arrogant thought, Hamel. You bastard, how can you talk to me when I don't even have WE in my hand? Don't act so surprised, WYD is just a catalyst. You signed a contract with me. Eugene already knew this. However, he was surprised that Tempest had initiated a conversation, since Tempest rarely spoke with Eugene when he wasn't holding WE. Hamel. How could I keep my mouth shut when you sincerely dream of the Northern Expedition when you're so near? Northern Expedition this, Northern Expedition that. You and I share the same lingering feelings. 300 years ago we failed to conquer the Northern Devildom. Miraculously, we were given another chance, so this time around we must successfully conquer it. Right. However, Hamel, that will be impossible with just the two of us. Even though Anise miraculously empowered the new Saintess, that still isn't enough. That was the case 300 years ago, and that is the case now as well. Although the key people responsible for taking the heads of the Demon Kings were a small number of elites, you were given the room to focus on the Demon Kings because the powers of the continent grappled with and impeded the armies of the Demon Kings. Eugene didn't deny it. It was true that Vermouth and the rest of them were key to battles against the Demon Kings and the high-ranking demons of Helmuth, but the allied armies also played a key role in several battles across Helmuth. We need military power to conquer the north. Hamel, let me make a suggestion. What, you want me to become the head of the Lionheart family? Well, is there really a need for that? This family values their identity as Vermouth's descendants to their cores. If there is a need, the whole family will immediately rise up and prepare for war. I'm not talking about Lionheart, Hamel. I am talking about you becoming the Emperor of Kiel. Pff. Eugene spat out the cold water he had been drinking after exiting the bath. He couldn't believe what he had just heard. What did you just say? It's not impossible. Even Molin became the king of a country, so why couldn't you be a king as well, Hamel? No, but this is. And if it is impossible for you to ascend the throne as the Emperor of Kiel, how about as the Pope of the Holy Empire of Eurus? I don't think it is impossible for you to become the Pope. If anything, it should be easier than becoming the Emperor of Kiel. Eugene, you have the Holy Sword with you. Moreover, Anise, the Saintess from 300 years ago, as well as Christina Rogerus, the current Saintess, are fully supporting you. Imagine this. Imagine you holding the shining holy sword and the Saintess following behind you with all her 8 wings unfolded. If you wanted to become the Pope, who would question your legitimacy in that country of fanatics? Tempest had a point. Eugene briefly imagined himself as the Pope. He would wear a robe of pure white, a gold crown on his head, and pray with a saintly smile. Wow! He couldn't help but want to barf. He couldn't even think about it, no matter how hard he tried. Of course, it was a possibility, but Eugene couldn't help but think that he would drive far too many subjects of Eurus down to hell as the Pope. I can't. I won't. Why? I'm sure I could if I wanted to, but I don't want to. Do you not want the power and authority of a king? Yeah, nope. I don't need it. Eugene dressed himself, disregarding Tempest's rambling. Looking back, he could see Gargith pouring hot spring water on his arm muscles. Eugene left the bath while shaking his head at his mysterious behavior. Christina and Mare didn't seem to be out of the bath yet, and Eugene momentarily contemplated heading up to his room to rest, but he still felt rather heated from earlier. Eventually, he put on his cloak and left the mansion. It was still snowing. Although it wasn't optimal weather to take a walk, it was perfect to cool down after taking a dip in the hot spring. Eugene started walking without a particular destination in mind. There were many people, or rather knights, on the street, though they didn't bother to put on their armor while in the fortress. The knights were dressed in different uniforms, and after walking for a little while, Eugene realized that he was striding through the zone assigned to Kiel. As if wanting to show off the power of the Empire, the Emperor of Kiel had brought the elites of 3 different knightly orders. The White Dragon Knights, headed by Alchester, were by far the best of the 3, but the Black Eagle Knights and the Silver Sword Knights weren't to be taken lightly either. Those with the black wings engraved on their chest were members of the Black Eagle. They looked at Eugene with curious, alert eyes, but did not bother approaching him or speaking to him. The same was true for Eugene. He had no reason to approach them. Although their gazes were slightly annoying, he ignored them and walked past. After walking for a little longer, he saw people dressed in colorful clothes, much unlike the knights. Mercenaries. He knew that several mercenary groups comparable to knightly orders had come to Lehane as well. Seeing as they were situated near the Knights of Kiel, they appeared to be mercenaries operating out of Kiel. Eugene was worried that some of the mercenaries would forget their place and pick a fight, but fortunately such things didn't happen. In a way, it was only natural. Mercenaries weren't all idiots, and those belonging to large groups were strictly disciplined, in some ways even more than knightly orders. After a while, Eugene had walked halfway around the castle. It was quite obvious. Just as the Emperor of the Kiel Empire stayed high in the castle, the people of the Empire were assigned a section close to the castle. On the other side of Kiel was the zone belonging to Eurus. Eugene turned his head when he felt gazes peering at him. He could see fear in their eyes and he knew why. Those hiding in the alley vigilantly watching Eugene were the inquisitors of Malficarum. Eugene didn't recognize the faces of those clad in red cloaks, but he could guess from their gazes who they were. They must be survivors from the Fount of Light. He had killed quite a few but not all. The lucky ones probably still lived with the injuries, while the really lucky ones had somehow managed not to meet Eugene at all. "What are you looking at, bastard?" Eugene had felt many gazes on his way here, but he had never found it necessary to speak. This time, however, it was different. He took the initiative, and when he glared at them, the inquisitors jumped back in surprise and disappeared somewhere along the alley. "What are you staring at me like that for?" grumbled Eugene before turning around and leaving. After taking a few steps forward, however, he suddenly felt a strange presence behind him. Bang! Just as he turned his head to check the source of this odd feeling, a crunchy sound startled him. He jerked around to find one of the inquisitors from earlier sprawled on the ground, with his head smashed in. "What's this?" Eugene glanced at the alley where the inquisitors had fled, but the person he saw there was not at all someone that he could have expected. Eugene remembered quite well that he had chopped off all her limbs, but that did not stop Hemoria from holding an inquisitor by the throat, using an arm she had gained from God knew where.